Welcome to this IOSH webinar on critical incidents. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm the interim chair of the IOSH Education Group Committee. If you're joining us live today and you have questions, you can post those in the Q&A, which is found at the bottom of your screen. And I'll now hand over to Chris and Julian from Pharos Response.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining this session on where health and safety meets PR or public relations. Thank you, very quickly, thank you to IOSH for hosting this session. And it's great to be with so many health and safety practitioners, as our world can sometimes be relatively solitary within a school or college. So it's great to be here with you. My name's Julian Penney, and I'll be handing over shortly to my colleague, Chris Gallant. But before I do that, just to let you know what we're going to cover in this session and the aims of it. We're aiming really to introduce some of the key aspects of communications or PR in the event of a critical incident related to your school, college, or educational establishment. As I said, my name is Julian Penney, and I've been involved for about the last 20 years as a health and safety practitioner, working with colleagues like yourself within the education sector or within adventurous activities or school travel. For the last 10 years, I've been working closely with Pharos co-founder Chris Gallant, who will be running the session, in helping organisations like yours respond to critical incidents. Not all of these situations, of course, are related to health and safety, but health and safety practitioners like ourselves are often involved and get called in to help in some way, shape or form due to the various skills that we have within health and safety. I'll hand over to Chris shortly, but before I do, just the contents and the structure of the session. We're going to be looking at two key aspects of critical incident response. First, before a critical incident, within the preparation. So I'll be looking a little bit at planning, incident plans and communication plans. We're looking at how to escalate incidents, so identifying and reporting situations, and then how you might prepare and train and test for incidents within your leadership teams. Then the second key part of the session will be how to respond to incidents, critical incidents, and we'll be looking at some top tips, the human approach to communicating in a critical incident, various different stakeholders and how best to work with them, and of course dealing with the press, and we'll be touching on social media as well. Just before we get into the main content and I pass on to Chris, I'll just introduce you a little bit about who we are at Pharos Response. There are some of you, I think, who may be within client schools or colleges of ours, but for many of you will be less familiar with us. So we're a risk and reputation management consultancy who support schools, colleges, universities, and others through three main ways, really, either through helping prevent incidents in the first place through site security audits, health and safety consultancy or retained advice, risk assessment training, and health and safety policy reviews and so on. Secondly, through preparing leadership teams and educational establishments for critical incidents through reviewing crisis management plans, bespoke crisis management training workshops, and simulation exercises. And then finally, we have a 24/7 support line where client schools and colleges and universities are able to access immediate professional incident management containment advice, crisis PR, social media advice, trauma counselling, and other services that help mitigate and contain the scale of the incident. The sorts of incidents that we deal with are wide and varied, and not all of them are health and safety related, and a few of them will just come on the slide here. All of these are complex, as you recognise as you just glance over them. They're not lower level accidents that get reported in an accident book, for example, and they will nearly always need communications response and support, either with staff, with parents, with students, the wider school or college community, and potentially the public. So they are complex to communicate through, and hence the reason for this session. So now I'll hand over to my colleague, Chris Gallant.
Good afternoon, everybody. So yes, my name is Chris Gallant. I've had over 20 years, too many years, over 20 years to continue to count, actually, working in communications. And the majority of that time I've actually spent trying to avoid or control the media coverage in the event of a critical incident. So quite unusual to most people who work in my field who are trying to get publicity. I'm trying to avoid it. So I'm going to take you through the majority of this session that, as Julian mentioned, refers to sort of the planning and the response phases of dealing with an incident. And as you can see from that previous list of incidents that we just showed you, Pharos supports clients with a range of critical incidents, some of which are health and safety related, but some are not. But in reality, the type of incident matters not, because the process and the philosophy to how you prepare and respond is exactly the same, or at least very similar. Critical incidents are clearly best avoided if you can. They're the best kind of critical incidents, is not to have one in the first place. We do spend a lot of time working with clients to help achieve this, but of course that's not always possible. So we do need to take that time to prepare in advance for what may come. And the speed that critical incidents can develop mean that prior planning is absolutely crucial. So the steps we'll go through will hopefully be useful to you. So what should your critical incident plan entail? We've said that planning is important. So what does that look like? Well, there's sort of the main headings that we would look to include in a critical incident plan when we support clients with doing this. It's, you can see there that the initial step when you get that initial notification of an incident is what the initial actions are going to include. And if we do get time at the end, I've got a slide on what those initial actions may be, and we'll include them. If you request the copy of the slides, we'll include that, but there's probably not time to go through each of those now because there's quite a lot of them. But that's the sort of thing that you might want to consider, is having a list of things that you're going to need to do, whatever the scenario specific to whatever the scenario is specific to. It's a list of things that you're going to do initially. As I say, well, there is a slide on that later. The escalation and reporting, and I've got a slide on this which I'll go into a bit more detail as well, is really key. So it's important that the plan defines what that escalation process is, and how incidents are potentially how they are defined within incident categories. But again, I'll talk about that a little bit more. We would also suggest you have critical incident team roles defined as well. So not necessarily the people, but actually the roles. So what are the roles on the team? And again, I'll be going into that in a bit of detail very shortly too. The next, sort of the meat of the plan, if you like, really is to have some scenario specific considerations. And this would be where you think, okay, my school might encounter a road traffic accident, we might encounter a fatality, we might encounter a serious safeguarding incident. And so you put a list of considerations specific to those scenarios together for each one of those. And then finally, some helpful instructions or templates, resources that you can mine in the event of an incident. You're highly likely to have to update your website, for example. Does enough people know in the school how to do that? If not, have some instructions with the various passwords and things you need. Do you know how to set up to amend your social media monitoring software? If not, include the guide in the back of the plan. Okay, so the important thing is that this plan is really helpful and useful in the event of an incident, which is why it's getting down to this level of detail. Otherwise, a lot of the plans we see from schools and colleges typically are there to pass the inspections, depending what type of school you are. But actually, in the event that they're needed, they're not always particularly helpful. So not only do you have a critical incident plan, but you should also have a communications plan. Typically, we find that schools and colleges, the communications aspect of the incident, of responding to an incident, is the bit that they struggle with most. So it seems a bit crazy that actually most plans that we see don't have a communications plan at all. They don't have a media plan. So we would suggest having some pages in the plan specifically to your organization to say how you want the general approach you know, the sort of communications messages you want to get across, we would suggest the human approach, which again I'll talk you through shortly. But also you should list your stakeholders specific to the school. So which stakeholders are you likely to need to engage with, and then what things are you likely to need to do. And again, I'll be going into this in a bit more detail further on in the presentation. And then finally, within the plan, you should also have a template statement, some sort of draft statements written linked to the scenarios that you've identified in your critical incident plan. So I mentioned road traffic accident, fatality, etc. Have statements based on those scenarios as well. Your key messages will be really key, so you know what messages you're likely to want to try and get across. And also you could have some generic questions and answers pre-prepared around your organization, particularly if you've had prior incidents. If you've had an incident that's generated media coverage, it'd be worth having some questions and answers drafted specifically to address those, because the reality is that old news is likely to get dragged up again in the event that you have another incident. And then finally, once you've got your plans in place, it's really important that your team, your critical incident team, whoever is listed as taking on some of those roles we mentioned earlier, that they know what their role would be in the event of a critical incident, that they know the content of this plan, and that ideally they've had a chance to practice it. So the DFE have written some guidance around emergency planning for the education sector, and they suggest that schools and colleges do an annual desktop simulation exercise, and it's something that works really well just to get the team focused on that what if factor. Okay, so that's sort of in a nutshell some of what we would suggest you do from the prepare perspective before an incident, and I'll just talk you through some of the detail I mentioned in that slide. So we talked about a critical incident team, and I'm sure you've all got this in your plans already, and we see various different ways that schools structure these, but this is how we would suggest you the sort of team structure that we know works well. So it starts with the leader, the critical incident management chair or leader, however you want to call it, and they're going to be responsible for directing, delegating, decision making. They might also be the spokesperson, depending on your organization, but the spokesperson role is something you'd need to consider specifically. We would also then suggest you have an operations lead, and they're looking after, as I say, the logistics and safety and that sort of thing. Normally, that's either the school business manager or the bursar in most schools. You need someone who's going to look at communications, who's going to take the lead on communications, not necessarily the spokesperson. This is the person that's going to be talking to the press when they call in. Who's going to be drafting the media statements, who's going to be thinking about your social media profile and your messaging and that sort of thing. And they'll probably be running a team. Well, all of these people at this level will be running a team of people providing support in these areas. Someone who will be responsible for welfare and can engage in sort of communicating with parents, pupils, staff, etc. And also thinking about the welfare of the critical incident team as well. Somebody who will be leading on business as usual. You're running organizations that can't just stop. Schools, colleges need to continue. You might have people on site when the incident happens. If the incident has happened on site, that obviously poses specific challenges. So trying to sort of make sure that the school day can run, if it's able to run as it would do normally, somebody needs to think about that while the rest of the management team is focusing on responding to this incident, because critical incident management will be all consuming. It will take up a huge amount of time. So someone else sort of running the day-to-day operation is going to be key. And then finally, a really key role is someone who kind of knits everything together, the admin support for the team. And this is usually the principal or head's PA, but they can set up the incident logs. They can make sure those logs are maintained. They can be ordering drinks and food and things to make sure that the critical incident team are supported, and just sort of providing access to things that, or you know, running prints off or whatever might be needed. They can be running around in the background, sort of keeping the team organized. So that's the structure of the typical sort of critical incident management team that we would suggest, and that's probably about as large as you'd want it to be. There's probably some roles on here that you're thinking are missing, and we would suggest you have co-opted roles that you bring in the event that they're needed specific to the scenario. So if you've had a cyber breach, you're obviously going to have your network manager or your head of IT or whoever it might be sitting on that team, but you're not going to need that person if you've had a health and safety related incident, in which case you guys would probably be sitting there on that team. You know, so that's the sort of, you'll pull people in as and when needed. If you've had a safeguarding breach from a member of staff, then you'll probably have a member of HR sitting in that team. So you can pull people in to join that team as needed. So just a few things to think about when putting this structure together, because as I mentioned in the plan, we would suggest having these roles set out, not the head, the school business manager, the safeguarding lead, etc. These roles can be adopted by anyone who's available, depending on you know, what's going on at school, college that day. So some things to consider would be who would fulfill these roles in the event that they were needed to. So who's the primary contact for each one of these? And if they're not available, who's going to stand in on their behalf? Ideally, particularly during the school holidays, if you have still have risk, if you maybe have trips and visits out during the holidays, ideally the primary person and the second person wouldn't be on holiday at the same time. They wouldn't be not contactable at the same time, just in case. But I appreciate that can be a challenge, but that's the ideal scenario. Who would be the spokesperson? And that's going to be very much dependent on your organization and who's received training to be spokesperson. There's obviously a big difference between being a spokesperson in the event of an incident, something negative, rather than being a wonderful advocate for your organization to say how well everything goes. And yeah, have they received training for that? And then what we would suggest you do in your plan is put a job description essentially together for each one of these roles, so that when someone takes that job on, they know what they need to do, they know how to respond, and they know what their remit is relative to the other teams, other people on that team. Okay. So that's how we would suggest structuring the team. It's also, might sound crazy, but it's also really important that you know that you've got a critical incident quickly. You might assume that you would do automatically, but it doesn't always present itself as being a more serious thing right at the beginning, depending what's happened. So we'd suggest you introduce a system so that everyone knows what and when to escalate any kind of incident. And we suggest this kind of triage system here, this 4-tier, as on the screen. You've probably got something similar in place for reporting health and safety incidents already. So why not extrapolate that to other incident types as well? It seems crazy that this isn't done as a matter of course from what we see anyway as standard. So we'd suggest using a 4-tier system as shown here. And I know most schools operate a 3-tier health and safety reporting system. So what we normally do is suggest that schools align the health and safety tiers with the lower 3 tiers that we've got here. So level 4, 3, and 2 would sort of correlate with typically with the 3-tier health and safety system you might have in school. That leaves level 1 free as kind of that nuclear scenario, that horrendous incident that you never thought you would have to deal with. But that's exactly what the critical incident management team should be there for. You know, an incident involving maybe multiple serious injuries, possibly fatalities, you know, a really sort of large scale incident where you know the press are immediately going to be on your case, and that's sort of what we reserve that level 1 category for. So if you do go down this route and you have these 4 tiers, you can provide specific examples under each of these tiers to say the sort of incident types that would make up each category. And that will enable efficient incident reporting, which should include near misses. And being health and safety professionals, I know you'll see the value in near misses. We sometimes struggle to get the importance of near misses across to people, but I know you'll recognise the significance of those. But this will make it really clear for the staff what they should and shouldn't report, and how quickly and who to, and how they go about it. So the kind of incident escalation process should be in the plan right at the beginning and really clear. Because if you don't know you've got an incident, or the right people don't know you've got a serious incident, then you're going to be starting from the back foot. And if this is particularly important if staff are on call out of hours, such as weekends or during the holidays. And again, depending who needs to be notified of a more serious incident, will they genuinely be contactable? And that's something to sort of look and check for yourselves as to whether they will actually be. Do they know that they're on call? Are they not going to the pub as a result of that, if you do have a trip or visit out at that time? So the rationale for this process really is if the right people don't know you've got a serious incident quick enough, it's really hard to make that time up that you've lost, and can prevent you from being suitably prepared for the next stage of the incident, such as when the press turn up at your front gate, or when something goes viral on social media. Okay, so just a couple of pointers around reporting and escalating incidents there. So once you've got your plans in place, your team know what they need to do, and you've done the necessary sort of training and everything else. You're as ready as you can be, I suppose, and you should hopefully sleep a little more easily, knowing that whatever happens, you've at least prepared proportionately for the risk that something could occur. So, in the event that you do have a critical incident, and you then need to activate the plan, here's a few slides on how to respond following that initial notification when you get that call. So you might find it helpful to divide the response, the tasks, into these 3 core areas. The operational response, focusing on the safety and welfare of whoever's been involved. The communications response, so it's looking at dealing with all the stakeholders, not just the media. And then finally, the business as usual. And this will help structure those initial meetings, especially to make sure that you're covering all 3 areas suitably. Obviously, the operational response and the communications response should run hand in hand, hand in glove. They should be very much running side by side each other, because what you say needs to absolutely be tied in with what you do, and vice versa. So just an overarching sort of pointers, I suppose, that overarching strategy to consider there. I mentioned the human approach earlier, and this is something that you can apply to any incident at all. You've got the you've got your structure in place, and you're following your immediate actions and that we mentioned earlier, that is outlined in your plan, to ensure that your team is tasked appropriately and they're responding initially to sort of gather the information and work out whatever has happened. It's really important to remember there's some general guiding principles that you can apply to any incident whatsoever, and this is the human approach. So as a school, college or university, you're all genuinely people-centered organizations. You're not a big anonymous corporate. You're not an oil company, and you don't produce widgets. So it's really important that above all other organizations, you're expected to respond with this human approach. That's how people will be judging us on the outside. And so genuinely being seen to put people involved in the incident at the heart of your response, both in terms of what you do and what you say, will be really key to making sure that you come out of it with your reputation as much intact as possible. So these 6 principles will help you keep you focused on that human approach, whatever the situation you're facing. So first up is to always put people first. If you put the people involved at the heart of the decisions you're making, and the actions you're taking, and also in what you say about what you're doing, you tell people in your press statements that you're providing support to the people involved, the people who've been affected, then the public sitting at home watching or reading the media reports will think, okay, well, these guys they've had a difficult day, but they're clearly doing the best as they can. If you just batten down the hatches and don't sort of share what you're doing, people won't necessarily have that same response. And that's why it's really important that you're seen to take ownership. You don't try and sort of, if it's an incident on a school trip, and there's a school trip provider involved, you don't try and deflect all of that responsibility to the school trip provider. From a parent's perspective, you guys have chosen the school trip provider. The parents have trusted in the school to pick a reputable school trip provider. So hence the school need to take some responsibility for responding to whatever has happened alongside the trip provider, of course. Responding quickly is really key. And this is why it's important to have that escalation process in place, so that you know that if there is an incident, you get reported, you get it reported to you quickly. And for MAT boards, I'm a MAT trustee myself, and it's really important that the boards that kind of sit slightly removed from the schools know that their schools will let them know if there is a major incident, because it's the MAT board that ultimately will need to be involved in providing and steering some of the response there, and ultimately will be the ones taking on the heat of any subsequent action following the incident. So yeah, and that should be consistent across all schools in the MAT, that that all schools will let you know as and when something happens. So speed's really important. It's also really important that the approach you take is honest, legal, and ethical. Now, it doesn't mean to say you're going to tell everybody everything that's happening, but what you do say has to be based on fact. It has to be ethical and morally the right thing. So essentially, it's good manners. It's doing the right thing in the face of whatever has occurred. It's important that you are seen to be visible and available. So you should have a spokesperson. Schools often ask us why we don't want to be spokesperson. We'll let the police deal with the press. No, they won't do that. The press won't speak, the police won't speak to the press on your behalf. They will speak on their behalf and they will say what's happened. But they're not going to be considering your brand. They're not going to be considering how the school is coming across. They're purely presenting the facts. So it's really important that you are ready to take that role on and be seen to have, to be the credible source of information. And then finally, to take that strategic view, to look left and right of the incident and think, what's happening next? Are you about to do a campaign to tell everyone how wonderful your school is to recruit new pupils for next year? In which case now might not be the time to release that. If you're an independent school, are you about to send out payment reminders? Maybe now's not the time to do that. There's a number of considerations that might make the situation worse. And it's important that you wouldn't necessarily see when just dealing with the incident with those blinkers on. So looking left and right is really key for making sure you don't inadvertently make the situation worse than it was, or than it is anyway. And ultimately, with critical incident management, quite often that's as best we can hope for, is to not make the situation worse, because you can't always make it better. Okay, specifically looking at the media, and I appreciate we're rattling through this. There's a huge amount of content in this, and we've only got sort of an hour end to end, and we want to save time for questions. So please do keep those questions coming. You can use the Q&A function, remember, at the bottom of the, or wherever it is on your screen, but there's a Q&A option. Type your questions in, and Julian's going to ask them of me at the end of the session. Okay, so managing the media. This is something that I've put together based on years of having to do this, and it's based on 3 phases, and it's based on the fact that you normally do get chance to go through these phases before the media find out and before the media make contact. It's not always the case. But in our experience, I would say about 9.5 times, 9 times out of 10, this is how it runs. You still get to know that you have an incident before the press contact you. And again, that's why it's so important to have that escalation reporting process in place. So phase 1, the calm before the storm, this is when you know you've got an incident, and this is when the comms person, team, however you're structured, the person who is on your critical incident team responsible for communications, this is when they need to stop and think, right, we've got to get things straight here. So they need to think from a communications perspective, how serious might this be? Where could it go? What's the risk factors involved in this? If you've got other communications people, or you've got a team, you've got external agencies you can call on. If you're if you subscribe to Pharos 24/7 support that Julian mentioned earlier, call us. But call in the team, brief everybody, because you need the team on standby. You need them ready to respond. Collate all of the information that you can, that you know to be fact, and identify the gaps that you need to consider. The operational team will probably be, they'll obviously be dealing with facts, but they won't necessarily be identifying some of the gaps in the same way you will from through a communications lens. So it's really important that we think, what would the press want to know? What would the parents want to know? How could that person have drowned? Was the river flowing too quickly? Did they crash into rocks when they jumped in? How did that come about? So ask the questions that are going to get those answers, that are going to get you those answers, because the likelihood is you're going to be asked those questions by someone, either the press or other stakeholders at some stage. You want a holding statement drafted, and that might be at the beginning, that will be very, very brief, because you won't have much by way of confirmed facts. So once the holding statement is drafted, you then want to set up your social media monitoring, and hopefully you've got social media monitoring in place already, but I know lots of schools don't. But it's really good to do that and consider it before you have a major incident. It's something that will basically, software that's constantly looking out in social media, and it's identifying any keywords that you've listed and notifying you when they get registered. So if you've got an incident, let's say it's a drowning on a school trip, you would add drowning school trip into those keywords and other relevant location names and things, and you'd be notified in the event that something was published. You're going to want to know. Agreeing your media strategy sounds really grand. All that means is, are you going to proactively go out to the press straight away, or are you going to wait for them to come to you? And normally we always suggest the latter. We would suggest most times you wait for people to come to you. There's a few occasions where we've suggested going out proactively, but that's sort of specific scenarios, normally where we know the story is going to break, we know you're going to be named, and actually the information that's in the press is quite damaging, and we need to correct it. Drafting questions and answers and key messages is something you'd need to be considering from that communications perspective as well. So you're ready for questions that might come in, and you know the key messages you want to get across in response to whatever has happened. Okay, so that's the kind of the comms person or team getting straight before then briefing the rest of the staff team. So remember to include frontline staff in your briefing. I learned the hard way in my first incident, my first fatality I was involved in within 2001 here. But make sure that reception, anyone in the school office in reception, or anyone who answers the phones, or possibly your facility staff who sort of, are around the site and managing the gates and that sort of thing. Make sure they know what's going on and what to do if they get approached by a member of the press or a parent or anyone else asking questions. If your school or college is particularly overlooked, then you might just want to pull blinds down or consider how to manage people peeking in if you are going to get those press turning up at the school gates, as we all know they like to do. So that's just something to bear in mind in advance. You don't really want to be filmed pulling them down. So it's the sort of thing that is quite helpful to do before they arrive, ideally. Partner press teams, you'll need to engage with them and let them know what you're doing, and I find out what they're doing. By partner press teams, I mean school trip providers will have their own press people. It might be the local authority will have some press teams that can provide you with some support. Less so these days, typically, but it's possible. If it's a catering incident, your caterers, if they're external, will probably have a press department or PR department. So it's those sorts of people I'm talking about here. Check for marketing conflicts. This is the point I was making before about if you're about to do a campaign going out to a load of people to say how wonderful your school is, you might want to not do that right now, particularly if someone has died and your campaign is talking about life-changing experiences at school, that sort of thing. Just consider holding on to those, particularly social. If you've got sort of timed social posts that go out that are planned and prepared in advance, people often get caught out by those because they'll just go anyway. You need to actually put a break on them. So make sure that that's not the case for you. You might want to quickly sanitize your website. Look through the website for anything that is likely to make the situation worse for you. So if you've just had a member of staff arrested, unfortunately, we deal with far too many cases of these. Typically, it's for downloading stuff from the internet. I probably don't need to say any more than that. You might want to remove them from your website before the media get involved and before the story breaks. So there's no photo and things on there for the press to be able to grab. Think about your stakeholders. So I mentioned in your plan that list of stakeholders. Who do you need to talk to? This is where you're going to go to that list of stakeholders and think, right, we've got the basics done. Now, who do we need to proactively tell? Our insurers is a key one, which should be done via the operations team, but it's still a really key stakeholder who'll need to know in the event of an incident fairly rapidly. And then the last point, update CRM as DNC, that's do not contact. So depending what system you use, ISAMs or whatever, you might just need to flag, particularly those families directly involved in the incident, that they're do not contact, that they can't receive all of those group messages, because the school's likely to be sending out regular messages to them. If again, an independent school, the last thing you want is to send an invoice to a parent while there's an incident ongoing on a school trip, for example. So it's just something to bear in mind. A really easy one to let slip through, but if you don't think about it, if you don't stop it, it can undo all of the amazing work you've done elsewhere to really build that reputation and to build those relationships. Okay, the final phase then is when the press do get involved. And this is where you then need to think about how you're going to manage those calls coming in. You could have a sudden flurry, and it's more than a full-time job for one or two people just dealing with these inbound calls, let alone social media. So establish that call log system so you know who's called in. Publish the statement online, so you've got a proactive message going out. So you'd actually put your media statement up onto your website. You might increase the frequency that you're monitoring social media. So you're reviewing that more urgently because it's likely that something is going to be posted. And you want to keep up to date with any misinformation that's being reported, so you can amend your statement so you remain in control of the message out there. Once something is reported inaccurately, if it's reported a few times, it becomes gospel and it's harder to retract. So you need to be, and that's why you need someone there to be in regular contact with the press in the event of an incident, so they can correct that misinformation. Otherwise it means you lose control of the situation, and that's what we spend quite a lot of our time doing for people, is correcting those inaccuracies. If you are likely to have to do interviews, whoever your spokesperson is going to need to prepare for that. Don't let them just step up in front of a camera and hear themselves saying for the first time that someone has died in front of a camera. That would be awful. So, do some practice interviews with them. I'll go through some practice questions. It doesn't mean you don't have to be a journalist to do it. The questions you're likely to ask will be fairly obvious. If you do subscribe to Pharos Response, it's probably going to be me that would be doing that with you. So we'll be working through that process with you. And yeah, remember to collate those media clippings. These days, obviously, most things are online. So just take some screen grabs, because those articles get updated, and it's really useful for you to have that record of what's happened and what's reported, so that it might be useful for part of the investigation, or why you made decisions to say certain things in the press. So it's useful to keep that as a sort of a paper trail. And then further down the line, there's other things you're going to consider about an investigation, and sort of future hurdles which may generate press interest, such as funerals, such as coroner's inquests, and that sort of thing. Okay, so but they're there for slightly slower time. So a whirlwind tour, really, through some of the key steps of what we would suggest you would do, and what we would be, let's say, if you do subscribe to Pharos, that's what we would be sort of doing some of this for you, and or we would be holding your hand through that process to make sure that's all done properly. But there's a lot there, but this is sort of how communication is managed. Okay, so just some sort of summary points then, I suppose, as we sort of get ready for moving towards those questions. So if you do have any questions, do add them to the Q&A function. So in summary then, recognizing you've got a situation and how urgent it is and who needs to be informed is absolutely key. So don't fall at the first hurdle by missing that all important incident notification call. Make sure that those phones will be answered, and whoever does answer them knows what to do with whatever information has come through. Follow your plan. Prepare a good useful plan, and then stick to it. Follow it. So many people forget that they've got their critical incident plan once the incident happens. And if it is a good plan and it's been put together in calm times, that's going to be really useful, that's a real shame. So, you know, follow the plan and consider communicating proactively. Remember to use the resources that are available to you. So you'll have resource available to you, whether it's Pharos, if you subscribe to our service, or whether it's the local authority, if they still offer that service. It tends to be less so these days, as I mentioned. You might have a PR agency that you retain that can provide support, but whatever resources you have, use them. It might be trustees that are particularly well connected, or governors. You use them, ask for help, because it will get busy. If the story breaks in the press, especially, it will be busy. So do make sure you engage those people, and engage them early. Don't leave it. It's always so frustrating when schools contact us a week after they've had an incident and they say, this is the situation we're in, and this is what we're now facing from the press. It's like, if you'd have told us a week ago, we could have helped ensure that you didn't end up in this situation. Now you are. Actually, there's not a huge amount you can do to wind the clock back. You know, it's harder to do that. So use the resources that are available to you when it happens. Remember the human approach. When it sounds easy sitting here listening to me talk on, but when the spotlight is on you, and particularly if it's on the school because of something that the school have done wrong, then it's really hard to remember to take that human approach. You can find yourself falling into the trap of getting very defensive. That's not where you want to be. Avoid the common bear traps, and I'll just list a few, but we often come across these. Always waiting for that next bit of information to come through before telling stakeholders. There'll always be something else you can wait for. You can be accused of you're not likely to be to cause too many problems by going out early and telling people that something has happened before you have all the information. But if you hold on too long, they'll say, why on earth didn't you tell me earlier? And that's not a great way to start. Obviously, there's a real key decision process there, but it's important that you don't just default to delaying. Don't fall into the trap of being seen to put that school's reputation first. If you're looking after the people and you're focusing on the people, your reputation will look after itself, because everyone will be seeing you doing the right thing. And that's why that human approach is important. Not only is it the right thing to do, but it's also will help protect your reputation also. Don't assume the press won't find out or they won't get involved, particularly if you're not all over social media. That they might do. So just to prepare for them. I've written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of statements over all the years that have never been used, and they're the best kind. But when they are needed, they're available. So draft that statement before the media get in touch. You won't make up the time afterwards. Getting sign off and key decisions made by, you might feel like you need to go to the board or the trustees or governors or insurers to make key decisions, but the delaying can sometimes be far more damaging. So sometimes you just got to make those tough decisions and go with it. A decision will be better than no decision. Don't think social media doesn't exist. It does, and there's so many cases where incidents have occurred and start and finished on social media. So you should have social media monitoring in place. It's something that, again, if you subscribe to Pharos, we can set up around the incident for you. But it's much better actually if you have it running all the way through. If you might have unhappy parents that are posting negative things about the school. It would be useful for you to know that anyway. So it's good to have in place always. And don't allow others to speak on the school's behalf. You should be responsible for your messaging. You should be that credible source of information that the press will come to you for answers on. If they go to others, the likelihood is they will say something that won't suit your narrative. So that's why it's important to have that sort of control, as I've mentioned before. Okay, just before we go to questions, just a few pointers there. There's the services that we provide to you, that we can provide for you. I'm not going to dwell on them. This isn't a sales pitch. It's just useful for you to have. We are offering a discount if you mention IOSH before the 6th of October, and you can follow that QR code to fill in an inquiry form. But let's go to some questions. So we'll invite Julian back in, and hopefully you've got some questions for us, Julian, have you?
Yes. Hi, Chris.
Hi there.
Thank you for that. We've got a few messages of thanks come through already, and a number of questions.
Right.
Probably inevitably, we've got a number of questions about social media, and certainly, I think that's probably changed the ability or changed the nature of some critical incidents because they've come out they've become public so much quicker. But I've got two questions about social media. The first one is, can we, as a school, stop the students or parents taking photos of an incident? And the second one, are there any tips about managing social media, because it can be very quick, and how we can manage this generally? So what about preventing taking photos, and wider, how to manage social media?
Okay.
It's happened so quickly. So
two quite different things there. Firstly, how to control whether information gets onto social media by allowing students, staff, parents to post about the incident on social media. We would. Some schools I know have a no phone policy on trips and things, and that's going to help you, because if they don't have a phone, then that's already in place, that's fine. We've had some schools that come back to us and say, we've had an incident and we've taken all the phones in from the students, we've taken the phones off them. That's not great, because these days removing a phone from a young person seems to be sort of tantamount to child abuse. They consider it to be absolutely the worst thing ever, and they will complain to parents. They will complain, and they typically will find another way of getting online that you don't know about, and they will share that you've tried to gag them. So don't go down that route. What I would do is have a grown-up conversation with them and say, look, if you've taken any photos of what's happened, I'd suggest you delete them. Remind them of all the training you've provided on social media, use and the digital training that you will have done in schools, and the risk of posting about this sort of scenario online, and the fact that actually the families involved in the incident won't want to find out via social media. It all needs to be controlled. So ask them to delete any photos and videos they've taken, and in our experience typically they do. If you remind them back to that training that they've had, they'll do it. If you don't remind them, it's just a process they'll go through. They'll think, I've got some footage here that's going to get some likes, and I'll share it immediately. So you need to be quite quick to do that. So that's and we do the same actually when we draft statements or emails for schools to send out to parents even about an incident. I'll quite often include as sort of the last sentence a request to parents to be thoughtful about how they communicate about this, and to refrain from posting on social media with respect for those who've been affected by it. If you remind people, typically they don't do it. So that's the first question. The second one was about how to manage social media, and I think that's a big topic. We could spend another hour just on that. But the key thing is to know that it's being discussed in social media. So to have that social media monitoring in place, there's a whole host of software platforms you can buy into. Some are free. The paid ones are obviously better, but you could probably do what you need to do with some of the free software. There's a number of different platforms. I'd let you Google it and sort of based on recommendations rather than me providing a recommendation on the spot now. But if you've got some monitoring in place, it's better than none. And once you know that the story has broken on social media, you can either choose to respond to it directly, or typically what we do in the event of a critical incident, you're not likely to have time to respond to all of those social media posts. So what we normally do is draft a statement for social media specifically that's normally the same, and it's normally sort of an initial sort of holding response, and then links people to the website for the actual detailed response from the school. And that's typically how we would suggest doing it, unless you've got a whole team of people who are able to provide one-to-one responses, which is unlikely.
Okay, Chris, thank you. That's a very detailed set of answers, but I think it's an area that most colleagues find a particularly challenging aspect of incident response. So thanks for the detailed answer on that. The second question, which is another tricky part, is if you received a question and the organisation may consider the information or the answer, presumably, as confidential, how would you respond? So I suppose some incidents may involve safeguarding, would be a classic example where the information is confidential. How should a school respond in answering information that's confidential?
Yeah, so I mean, we come across this a lot because a lot of the incidents that we support schools and colleges with are around safeguarding or information that you can't share much information about. But what you can say is what you're doing, what your standard procedures are, so that when you actually stop to think about it, there's a lot that you can say that's not actually talking about what's happened, and it's important to say something. So typically we go to that. We sort of acknowledge that we're aware of the incident. We explain what we're doing to get to the bottom of it, and who we're working with, and then we'll look at something around what the standard procedures would be to prevent that from happening. So in the event that we have a staff member that's been arrested, we'll be talking about the fact that what the safeguarding procedures are, the fact that safe recruitment was followed, and training is provided, safeguarding training is provided however regularly, that sort of thing, to show that you've done everything you could to have prevented this from happening.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Hopefully that's answered that question. Another from a colleague, again, this is another common theme with many organisations, especially colleges and schools, that sometimes an insurer may tell a school not to release anything about an accident in case of a claim, if a child has been injured and so on. What's your view on that and how that conflicts with the human approach about visible and available?
This is a regular challenge. And have a conversation with your insurer. Let them know what you're planning on doing. It's easy for your insurer's lawyers just to say, don't say anything, because your insurer's lawyers are going to essentially be trying to reduce the size of any potential claim that may go to the insurer. You're trying to think about your reputation and doing the right thing for forevermore. They won't be so worried about what happens to you tomorrow. So there are many cases to look at where people have followed their lawyer's advice to the letter and it's gone badly. But we would try and engage, again, if you work with Pharos, we would have that conversation with them for you or with you. But I would have a robust conversation with them about why you need to communicate and what you want to communicate. And normally there's some middle ground there. We quite regularly have those conversations with lawyers, and they realize it's a bit of a game of tit for tat, really. They normally do roll over and let us do the right thing, particularly if they know you're getting advice.
Great, thanks, Chris. Another question is, I've been asked to write a new crisis plan, which I'm now going to call a critical incident plan. How detailed and how long should this be? Any advice?
Yeah, well, hopefully some of the headings at the beginning were helpful to you. We are running a webinar for schools, not through IOSH, but we're running a webinar specifically on in November, I believe, on the critical incident plan structure. So by all means, email us on the email that's on the screen, and we can invite you to that. That's a free webinar. But the more detail, the better. You know, don't think that the plan should be really short. The way we structure our plans is actually to have quite a lot of information in, but you would never read the plan beginning to end. You pull the sections out of the plan that you need to deal with the situation. So if you are the operations lead, you would pull the job description for the operations lead out. If you've got a safeguarding breach scenario, you pull the safeguarding breach scenario guidance out. And then you've got two bits of paper essentially that you're referring to. So the plan is a resource. It's a pack of information that you can mine. It's not meant to be something you sit and read beginning to end. And you certainly shouldn't be seeing it for the first time when you've got a major incident.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question I've got is, our media spokesperson is our principal. In the event of an incident on an off-site trip, should they be at school or at the scene of the accident?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it depends where it happens and what the rest of the team are able to do. So the principal is likely to need to be at the school, typically, because they're likely to be the incident leader, the team leader. So it would be reasonable for them to do interviews from the school, but have a designated room where you would conduct those interviews that's away from your critical incident team room. Think about where you're going to be able to give journalists tea and coffee, where you're going to look after them, and where you would actually conduct interviews. I would avoid the interviews in front of the school gate. Invite them in, feed them tea and coffee, keep them dry, out of the rain. You've got a big enough site, I'm sure. So, you know, it's kind of just the better thing to do, and it just keeps it out of the public eye as well. Your principal doesn't want to go out to the front gate and do interviews and get wet and you know, and have everyone cars driving past honking horns and things. It's just distracting. So take control of it and look after the journalist, and there'll be a much better frame of mind if they've been fed tea and biscuits rather than been left out sort of getting wet under their umbrella.
Okay, thanks, Chris. The mention of tea and biscuits has really taken us towards the end. We're right at the end of the session now, so perhaps it's lunch rather than tea and biscuits. But thank you for answering those questions. There were some others, and I think they can be addressed either through IOSH or through the email that you've got on your screen there. Andy, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say to your members before we go.
Yes, I'd just like to first of all say thank you to you, Chris and Julian, for a really insightful session. Thank you to those of you that have joined the session today and for your inputs in the Q&A, and thank you to IOSH for hosting us today. Please do visit the IOSH Education Group web pages and social media, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.